So in the US, this is very common, and you see this in the media. Oh, companies in Chapter 11. And Chapter 7 then would be the part of the bankruptcy code where you find the liquidation part. I'm not quite sure about the German Insolvenzordnung where you find this there. The kind of like if you look up the Financial Times or the Economist or any newspaper, you will find the reference to these two chapters here. So that's why I put them down. So I hope the general procedure is clear. I know it's not really in the details of how bankruptcy works. It's pretty superficial, but that's kind of the level that you need to understand the cash flow consequences and the contracts, how they work. So then let's look at the two big buckets of contracts that we have, equity and debt, and how they're different in these different dimensions that I mentioned. So most important part about equity, or big difference to debt, is that equity has an infinite lifetime. Right? So there is no expiry date on an equity contract or share. Equity is the general term. That could be a private company or a listed company. If the equity is traded on the stock exchange, then we call it stocks or shares. I have a page, I think it's actually here on this one as well with the shares. By the way, I use the word stocks and shares synonymously. I think the one is rather used in British English and the other one is rather American English. Yeah. But people rather say it's shares when they think about the individual securities, but then they say stock markets. So there's a weird mix of terminology. I really don't care about the difference. Good. So first about cash flow rights. So the cash flow rights are that you're eligible to receive a dividend or any kind of share of the profits of the company. Right. Remember, profits are basically is the money you make after everything else has been paid, including the payments to the debt holders. Right. So you first have to pay off the debt holders, and then if something is left over, you can pay that out in form of a dividend. Right. So, importantly, then you can only pay out a dividend if the company is profitable. Big corporations can manipulate that a little bit because of their structure. So you typically have a group and you have the single holding. So the single holding company is the company for which you actually trade the shares or buy the participation. But then the company might have many subsidiaries. Right? So in every annual report, you find a group report basically aggregating all the subsidiaries. And that might be unprofitable, they may make a loss. But then they have only the single holding companies, and through kind of clever shifting of cash flows and kind of profits from subsidiaries to the holding company, they can achieve a situation where the holding company makes a profit and you can pay out a dividend, but the group itself is unprofitable. Right? So the dividend is here, it's based not on the group profit, it's based on the single holding profit. So dividends are decided on for stock companies on the annual shareholders meetings. So there is a vote. So usually there is a proposal by the management. They're going to retain some part for future investments, and they want to pay out some stuff. And usually they have a strategy that they kind of want to maintain a stable kind of trajectory. So they're increasing the dividend kind of steadily over time, let's say 5% per year or so. We'll have an example of this later on because you could use this as part of a valuation tool for stocks, the so-called dividend discount model. And then, which is not really a cash flow right from the company, right? This is the money that you get from the company, so the issuer of the claim. But of course you can generate a cash flow by selling the shares, right? But then it will be some other person who gives you the money, it's not the corporation. For the influence on decisions, we have to distinguish two types of contracts, and I focused here on the traded contracts because there is the big difference. So there are the common shares, and in German you would say Stammaktien, and then there are the preferred shares, which are called Vorzugsaktien. So the word preferred shares is a little bit misleading because actually you have to give up something. You give up the voting rights. So actually less rights than the common shares have. But the preferred part is that you get a little bit of a higher dividend. So a company, if the company has preferred shares, they must have common shares. Can you maybe think of a reason why companies would do that? So you have the common shares with full voting rights, and then you have the preferred shares that don't have a voting right but a higher dividend. Why would you want to do that?
Maybe to keep.
Yeah, so I think there were two people.
Maybe because people in the company want to have the company within the control of a certain group, like a family.
Yeah.
Let's take an example in Switzerland. It's Hoffmann La Roche, pharmaceutical company which has most of the people who control the company owned within the family.
Yes, very good. So that's the typical case also in Germany for. Does someone know by chance some companies in Germany that have preferred shares? Following the argument, think about family-owned companies that were traditionally family-owned.
It's just a guess, but could it be Henkel?
Yeah, Henkel is on the list.
I think Volkswagen.
Yeah, so there is part of a family, right? There is the Piech Porsche family who owns it. There's also another big shareholder in Volkswagen.
DSG Porsche Holding, SE.
Yeah, and another one. It's still the family. So in which state is the headquarters of Volkswagen?
Niedersachsen.
Yeah, Lower Saxony in English. Yeah. So actually, the state itself owns 20 or 25% of Volkswagen as well. Right. So the family at the local state, they share the common shares, and you can trade the preferred shares as private investors. And basically, the reason is they don't want you to influence the decisions. Yes, we have Henkel, Volkswagen. Any other big company that comes to your mind? Let's stay with automobile companies, which is another big family-owned company in Germany. It's the one from Munich, BMW. It's owned by the Quandt family. So, but they actually made a conscious decision to retire most of the preferred shares and kind of share their voting rights because they're basically also two kind of like a brother and a sister who now own a big part, and they kind of wanted to diversify, and they sold a couple of their shares. They're still the biggest shareholders of BMW. But, and then there is another one that we could add to the list from the energy sector. That would be RWE, and the reason for that is that you have like local authorities in North Rhine-Westphalia which own the Landschaftsverbände and cities, which own part of the local utility there. So that's what RWE has preferred and common shares. I think there are a couple of more on the list. So if the company has both types of shares, they have to tell you in the name. So typically you find an abbreviation like ST and VZ in Germany. And so if you go, for example, through the list of companies in the German stock market index, if there is no such abbreviation, then you can be sure that it's only ordinary shares. And then for the DAX index, they make a decision to actually use the type of shares which are more traded by private investors, the so-called free float. So sometimes it's actually, for BMW, it's the ordinary shares, and for other companies it might be the preferred shares, because the family shares are not kind of traded actively. Right? So if you see ST or DZ somewhere in the name, then you know they must have both types of shares. And for you, it then could make a difference because the prices would be different and the cash flows that you get from them are different. In the US, you could have a similar structure, and sometimes, well, they don't have the names like this here. They have share classes. So the ordinary shares would be Class A shares, and the preferred shares would be Class B shares. Right? So if you see something like Class A, B, C, or so, then usually you have different voting rights associated to these different classes. But I think it's much less common in the US. I'm not really aware of any big company that has something like this. So there's a special rule around preferred shares that's worth noting, and that is when the company doesn't make any profits and thus can't pay a dividend, the actual preferred shares gain the voting right, right? So for the unprofitable firm that's not paying any dividends, the preferred shareholders are not left with nothing. So you either get the dividend or the voting right, right? So if the company's in trouble, they can vote in the shareholders meeting. So that's why the company always has an interest to pay off the preferred shareholders a little bit at least. And there is a rule that you actually have to catch up the dividend before kind of you lose the voting right again. But most of the time, in ordinary times, there is no voting right associated to the preferred share.